Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon. Thank you for hanging around. It's really not easy to give a lecture after lunch, but I really appreciate you being here. And I want to give thanks to George Mason University first, to Ajiji for sponsoring such a wonderful event. Quite frankly, I agree with my former colleagues. I wish there were more US government representatives and also other activists. And I also have to say, I wish there were more people from the Muslim community as well, because I think that what we're talking about affects all of us in different ways. I want to tell you what my claim, how I've become so-called, my claim to fame, so to speak. And that is that many years ago, when I was a young woman, I was the first American Muslim woman to join the CIA. So I joined the Counterterrorism Center, and I worked there for a number of years, and this is prior to 9/11 and after. And so having that insight, understanding human intelligence sources, understanding collection and targeting, but more importantly, as someone like myself, and I was 24 years at the time, more importantly, trying to help Al-Qaeda and the Bin Laden unit, our operators and our analysts, trying to help them understand the threat from an ideological perspective, because that did not exist. Trying to answer basic questions on Islam. And so when I would be asked about, when Dr. Munoz talked about Sayyid Qutb's milestones, I said, before you read Qutb, why don't you just open the Holy Quran? That might sound controversial and a little highly sensitive, but I really meant it. Because the verses that are being misinterpreted, misused, and quite frankly misaligned, or attached to violent extremist groups, need to be then appropriated correctly. And so many people in the intelligence community, and even and many even, I would say, argue Muslims today, whether you're radical or not, do not understand the basic principles and the tenets of religion, do not even have a command on the Arabic language. Mubin, if you're here, Mubin is one person who really wish he was, he's in the audience somewhere, understands what I call three things. And this is what I speak on when I'm in different settings, is that, and this is one way to diffuse the religious, violent narrative, which is you need an understanding of Islamic history, an understanding of Islamic theology, an understanding of Islamic people. And when you have those three, that empowers you. And I know it's a cliche and an old adage to say that knowledge is power, but it's true. And when you look at those who've defected from ISIS, Ahmed is here, Professor Ahmed, who's doing a study with my friend Ann Speckert on the ISIS Defectors Project, and you look at others, and my own interviews. I've traveled through various conflicts, and I've tried to understand motivations, which can be individual, societal, organizational, and so forth. And that can only be done, in my humble opinion, by actually going to the source. Those experiences, being in conflict yourself. And I find that many of us, we're blessed to be here, we're far removed. And by being removed from conflict, it can be quite a challenge to truly understand what motivates certain individuals. So now, no longer affiliated with the US government, although I'm still invited to teach certain classes on Islam and radicalization. I also spent about 5 years training our US Army and the Air Force captains and so forth on Islam. And while that was a wonderful opportunity for me to serve and to teach as our military was serving in Iraq, for example, and trying to ask very difficult questions of what's the difference between a Shia and Sunni. I hope we all know what the difference is in this room now, but those were the pivotal questions that our military and government were trying to answer. But I have to say that answering those questions was just, and knowing the answers to those questions is just the first part. The second part is, I would like to piggyback on what a wonderful lecture by Scott Mann, is that tell the story, but I take it a step further, and when you tell the story, you need to act on the story. Because one thing I've learned from all my travels and all my interviews with even militants and terrorists and even their family members, is that we have to also act on the story. There are political realities that are in play here that we all acknowledge. And many terrorist organizations, I've had the pleasure of studying under Dr. Gerald Post, who's now retired from GW's political violence program. But one thing I learned from my professor is that we need to also address those personal and political grievances. And so that's where you take the story and you reshape it and you involve the people who are causing political upheaval and so forth. All right, let me just start with what I call a traditional conflict, because I just finished a book and I published it this February. It's called Secrets of the Kashmir Valley. And when we look at conflicts, so many I've heard Afghanistan mentioned, and of course our interest now in Iraq and Syria. But Kashmir has been a conflict that has been very dear to me. And it's a conflict that is old. It's raged on for nearly 70 years. And some of the same grievances play out in Kashmir. And even though the talk that I'm giving, let me just as a footnote add why women win, I want to also add two very important words, that men matter. Women can't do this alone without the cooperation of men, particularly in patrilineal and patriarchal societies. Men also play a very important role. And I'm going to give you some examples. I'm going to give you pictorial illustrations of some of the campaigns that I've been involved in Yemen, for example, many years ago against Al-Qaeda in Pakistan and so forth. But I'll come to that later. So looking at this age-old conflict of Kashmir, you can see that these are women who have used something very traditional, which is street protests. Street protests still continue to, particularly in areas where there's no other way to engage digitally. Anyone want to know why? Why is there a lack of digital engagement in Kashmir or in certain conflicts in the world? There's no power. Or if there is power, it's shut down. It's cut off, particularly on national holidays. And I know this is a very controversial conflict, because you have more than two sides. You have the Indian perspective, the Pakistani perspective, then you have the local Kashmiri, they're called separatist perspective. And I'm not going to dive into the politics of this conflict. I'm just here to tell you that when, just being present and have spent many years traveling back and forth, which, by the way, for me, was not easy. I was born in Pakistan in the cultural city of Lahore, but I migrated to America and raised in the heart of Texas since I was a child. So I've been, I say to people, I'm a Southerner by heart. But now to try to go to the other side, and that's my point, that sometimes when we look at our narratives and stories, we don't see the other side. We don't, in fact, see the multiple facets of conflict that have affected people. And so women use the one thing that they have, their voice, which is amplified through the microphone, and here you can see they're in ultra-conservative garb, using Islamic slogans and symbolisms, and something that's very simple, which is what has been used by secular nationalists before the rise of religious-motivated terrorists, which is freedom, a call to basic human rights, violations that have been perpetrated by either state actors or regional countries. In this case, it would be India and Pakistan. So United Nations, where are you? And while for many years, having worked in the government and having worked very closely with our US military counterparts here and in the Middle East, I have great respect for what our elites and government officials are able to do. I've realized, and I think we all can probably agree, and we've all said this in some way or another, that the approach to this counter-narrative, counter-messaging approach has to be from within local communities. It has to be local individuals, because they are affected the most. And if we really want to shape the story and to frame it in a way that will be powerful and effective, then you have to ask them to write that story, in addition to telling the story. So in this story, it's very simple. Women are arrested, they're detained, and then they're released, and it's just another day. And it goes on and on. And in other words, there is no end to this conflict. And as I look at the example of Kashmir, and I try to impose some of the lessons learned on what those of us in the room, Ed and so forth, who are looking very closely at the anarchy in Syria and Iraq, we see some of the cyclical violence that continues. And so I come back to the earlier point, and the one key lesson that I have learned again and again is that we have to address the political realities. We've all talked about, in some form or another, personal grievances and political grievances, but we have to shape that as well. And if we don't act on the story, then the message itself falls flat. And that's my humble opinion. So I'm going to have to breeze through this, because quite frankly, 30 minutes is never enough for some of these very deep issues that we have to discuss. I do acknowledge this is a very difficult topic of looking at women and violent extremism. Many scholars and so-called terrorism experts have never met a female militant. I never probably have even gone into jails to interface with her. I have become, I've learned a great deal from my government experience, but now having left government, from being a tactical now into, I've taken those skills, and now I've been able to freely enter communities. Now, some people think that that's odd for me because I was with the agency. So how is I, as an American Muslim woman, able to gain access? And I think if you're sincere and you truly listen, that people really want to do one thing, and they want to tell their own story. They want a voice, especially in places where their voices have been dampened. So there are certain challenges to doing this, and this is not new. This is what always startles me when we're looking at the term we use, these female jihadis, and women in violent groups, or women's participation in battle. Let's make this more neutral. And I often say it's not new. 1400 years ago, in the early days of Islam, if you look at the battles, there were women who were equally concerned, equally motivated, equally determined to protect their prophet and their religion in those early battles that took place against the pagan Arab Quraysh tribe. So women have always been motivated. And in fact, many terrorism scholars now acknowledge when the question is asked, why now? Why do women join? What are they motivated by? You can find that even in the same family, Mubin, you're back now. I referenced you earlier. Mubin has done great work on this. You'll find that men and women in the same family will have comparable experiences. So it's understandable that women would also join, or they may be motivated by a framework that I'll come to in a minute, which is this. Dr. Mia Bloom's a friend of mine, and she wrote about this as well, and it's in her book, Bombshell. And there are many other women who've looked at this issue, and they'll acknowledge there's some very basic, overarching motivations, which you can read here. And then there's another thing, which is emotions. Now, I don't want to argue here that Muslims by nature are more emotional people, but I do think that in certain societies, in certain countries, where the political expression is not allowed, and where Muslims feel marginalized, and they don't have the level of education, sophistication, or judgment that we might have, then it's easy to tap into those emotions. And I find that in my birth country, Pakistan, all the time, particularly in an election year. I mean, heck, it's happening right here in America. So I think this is universal when we look at how elections shape our frame of mind. But it's certainly true, and many of you, I work with, and Dr. Post was also a psychiatrist by training, and so we would spend, and he, I was very blessed to travel with him on his trips. I would appear at annual psychiatric conferences, for example, and I was the only person in the room who's not a psychiatrist, but because I happened to be a Muslim, often I was the token Muslim woman who was able to speak about some of these issues, and I've seen this myself. I've also seen this, but then what do we do about it? It's the next step. So much of our work, and what I think Scott Mann is speaking to in our failures in stability operations, is also our failure in assisting these individuals, and it comes down to research. We spend a lot of time and money on research and surveys, and all of that's important, but I'm very interested in what I call action-based research and what we can do on the ground, and I think that the grassroots campaigns and initiatives are very important. I'll give you an example very recently. I've been traveling, and so in Lebanon, there are two girls who are Christian. I don't want to name them because they're keeping their affiliation quiet because of the work that they do. But I'm so proud of them. And it's a small NGO, and through funds that they've received from the United States, they're able to work with the children of the camps in Lebanon. So these are refugee children, and what they do is they provide them, for example, and these are boys and girls, online training, anger management. Both of these girls, they're social workers, and so they have that counseling background, and that's what they say, that what is desperately needed. But despite their efforts, what I fear is that efforts like this, which have a great intention and are conducted by wonderful, kind-hearted women, will also fall flat without government support and acknowledgement. Why do I say that? Because in a country like Lebanon, you may know that refugee children don't have documents, they don't have papers. So it's almost as if they don't exist. And without those documents and identity, and we all know when we've spoken about the importance of identity and belonging to a group, that then they themselves feel marginalized. And it's very easy then for a group like ISIS then to tap into that and say, I'm going to give you an identity, I'm going to give you money, I'm going to give you a place in which you can belong, and more importantly, I think it all ties into a sense of purpose, when you have purpose, a purposeful life. All right, so the role of women, coming back to my core argument, is all of the above. We seem so startled these days by the women who is operationalized, women who are now joining ISIS and fighting in Libya and so forth. And I haven't been surprised, because many years ago, you may recall Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was the late al-Qaeda leader in Iraq, who was killed by a strike. He actually innovated the use or operationalized women. And so we've seen this since March 2003, when the first woman who was featured on Al Jazeera, she was in her 40s, and then she was fighting to protect Saddam Hussein, so it was secular nationalist motivations and intentions, and then, and so forth. And so you've seen a wide range of women. And what I find, I was working with US military commanders. I was at the RAND Corporation at the time, and then working with our commanders in Iraq, and there was such mystery enshrouded in women's intentions and those who actually joined, that there was an email that was sent to me, and it's, I don't mention the officer's name because I'm thankful to him for helping me with his insight. But while we were looking at these sites, so to think that, by the way, it's not right to think that ISIS has capitalized, or certainly ISIS has capitalized in the social media space and has become truly a virtual organization that we need to counter. But it's not the only one. Propaganda has existed for a very long time, and in many different forms, and certainly with the role of women as well. There was a site called the Mujahidat. Mujahidat is from the word mujahideen, it means female fighters, and then it was taken down. And then many of these male fighters actually supported women, including, you might remember, the late al-Qaeda leader in Saudi Arabia, Yusuf al-Ayari, who we used to call AKA Swift Sword, was one of the leaders who wrote an entire book on the role of women. And so this has existed for many years prior to what we see in ISIS today. And so this was an email. This is an exact email that I've summarized from the military officer. We didn't know who they were, and I remember I interviewed an officer. He was a young man in the army, and he had just came back from Fallujah. And he said, well, we're told we can't look at them, and if we can't look at them, how do we know what we're dealing with? And so, of course, through time, some of those policies have changed, and we've seen now Daughters of Iraq, and we've seen women involved in law enforcement agencies and so forth. But that didn't change those girls and women who would join the organization. And even though we may not acknowledge the role of Islam, or we kind of downplay it, the role of Islam, I truly believe that this is really important. And why do I say this? Because Islam is, I'm diving into controversial territory here, because I've seen both sides of the debate, that Islam has very little to do with violent extremism, or that Islam has everything to do with why people join. And I would say that it's actually, it depends on the person who joins. So rather than making a blanket, generalized statement, we have to look at this case by case. There are certain converts, for example, I'm going to come to them in a moment, who, when they come to Islam, particularly if they're in a family, and I grew up with some of these converts in Texas, for example, or in here as well. They don't really they're very excited, and they're just motivated to come to Islam because it gives them belonging and community and so forth. But until they truly understand and learn, they will be misguided. The same is true for Muslims who are born into the faith, who never study, and it's even true. Last night I was at a workshop in an Islamic center, and we talked about, the example was given of a sheikh, that even the Islamic scholars and sheikhs within the Muslim community here are so busy trying to Islamicize everyone else that they've lost sight of what their own children are doing. So the child of the sheikh was called an atheist, because, again, it comes back to what the term that's been used here eloquently is families first. And I like the term that the teacher said last night, it's circles of control and circles of influence. So your circles of control are those who are your family, your friends. It could be yourself. Focus on jihad bil nafs, yourself, and being a better person. But then you extend that circle of influence, and that's the community. It could be your country. It could even those who have a global reach. And I would put ISIS in the category of circle of influence. And I would also even put some very other, Muslim moderates in that as well. So this again comes back to theology and an understanding of theology which has been misinterpreted and misguided. And I don't want to dive into this because of lack of time, but just to say that this literature has existed for a very long time, even prior to Al-Qaeda. Prior to Al-Qaeda, my father is a linguist for the Defense Department, so he collects a lot of material and then he translates it, and he also provides language training for the US Army officers. And so one thing my father and I did together is we collected jihadi magazines from Afghanistan at the time of the Soviet invasion and the time of the rise of Mujahideen. It is astonishing. You would think, because we don't see women fighting that jihad at the end of the Afghan war, but women played a very important ideological and supportive function in that war, and you can see that in their literature. So there's a lot that we don't know because it's not advertised, but we focus more on the glossy magazines, but that literature and that message has existed for quite some time. Now, as I wrap up here, I want to just give you some very quick cases. You all have know about the San Bernardino case of Tashreen Malik, but there's still so much mystery of, again, and I always say that a dead terrorist means dead information. I mean, it just means that we don't really have a clue on how this woman was actually indoctrinated, whether it's through her husband or whether she took the lead. I can tell you, though, from my own experiences on certain cases, and publicly I can say Sajid al-Bashari was one of them, we know now, but there are other cases I can't talk about for security reasons, and you can understand, is that women have also been drivers. So women have also, the husband and wife hit team, Sajid al-Bashari, who perpetrated the attack, or at least she tried to in Amman, Jordan, at a hotel, but she failed to detonate because she couldn't get on the switch. Well, her husband did, and anyway, she was the first woman to be arrested within the Al-Qaeda network, and you'll recall last year she was hung in Jordan. So she's a very popular case, and anyhow, so women do play a very important role, even though we as Americans, we were stunned and we were shocked and rather surprised by this husband and wife hit team. But here's a story that I find even of greater fascination, which is what I call the Denver Girls. I'm writing a book now, my second book, which I tentatively titled Struggle for the Soul of Islam. But there's a chapter called the Denver Girls. I was in Denver, Colorado a couple of months ago, and I was able to interview the families in the community, the Somali and Sudanese community members. And I remember a young 21-year-old Somali youth director said to me, when I asked him about the two Somali girls and the Sudanese, there were 3 of them, and they were teenagers who were indoctrinated online and then were on a plane with their passports and money headed to Syria. Their plane was intercepted in Germany, and they were brought back home. Now, they were not charged because they were minors, but more importantly, because the Attorney General at the time wanted to send a message, and actually it was his goodwill gesture that they were not charged, otherwise they would have been charged. And I remember this youth director, when I asked him about this case, he said, "It's easy to join ISIS here." That still gives me chills when I say that. And why is it so easy to join? And then you have to understand what I've often said is context counts. You have to look at the context of which this happened. You have to look at the fact that these girls were sheltered even living in America. They had their home life and their community center, and then they went to school. So there was very little else for these girls to do. In fact, one of the she's a Sudanese activist in her community, and she said to me, "We don't empower our girls. ISIS does." And even though that might sound counterintuitive to radicalization, that was just a very striking comment for me. So these girls are back in their communities. In fact, the Sudanese girl, I went to her home, but she's so riddled with shame, and her family is still ashamed, even though this happened 2 years ago, that she is not back in school. But the Somali girls are back in school, and it comes back, and I think it's because the community is very strong, it's resilient, it's also backed these girls, and they've been able to adjust back into their society. But I find a fascinating case. You remember the girl you see here, Shannon Conley, if you remember that case. She actually was on her way to Syria, but then she couldn't even leave. I mean, she was detained at Denver International Airport, and she was a girl, she's the classic Muslim convert. the Muslim convert who is not only misguided, but is lured into the internet by a man for promise for marriage. And this is a classic case because we've seen so many examples like this. But what I find so sad and so tragic about Shannon, even though she was, given a sentence for 4 years in jail, so the judge said, to deter other girls from doing what she did, is that, and he said she's a mess. She's got psychological problems. And what Shannon said in her defense in the courtroom is, I didn't mean it. Like, she didn't take back her statement of wanting to support violent jihad or to support ISIS. No. She said, I did not mean to hurt anyone. I wasn't doing this with the intention of actually killing anyone or hurting anyone. And it speaks to a much larger issue and motivation, which is social justice. The concept of social justice is very powerful, and that many of these young people, and of any age, feel that they're actually contributing to, creating not a caliphate necessarily, that comes later, but they're promoting social, political change. So it's humanitarian in nature, and that's how they see it. And then you'll recall the New York girls, or women rather. One was, Noelle is 28, and the woman next to her, Asiya Siddiqui, is 31. By the way, don't confuse Asiya Siddiqui with the Asiya Siddiqui who's sitting in jail in Texas. The first Asiya Siddiqui, who was a neuroscientist from Pakistan, who studied and who is, through affiliation with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, KSM, is then, anyhow, so that is the classic Asiya Siddiqui case, but she had the same name. Here are two women who online, trying to put together a bomb and so forth. But the reason why I show this case is because it's the power of nasheed. Those of you who know nasheed or Islamic songs or Islam, it is, if we think about, when I think about counter messaging, I also look, if they're using Islam, not only in the Quran, and they may use hadith literature or the oral traditions, but they're also using nasheed, which are these Islamic hymns or songs, and poetry. If you look at Noel's poetry, you can see how that plays a very powerful role. Then we also need to look at the symbols and the signs and the way that they're being used for radicalization. All right, now let's get into the fun stuff. Some of the campaigns that I've been involved with. One of them during our height of the war in Iraq, many of the mothers of insurgents, mothers would protect their insurgent sons, and so it's very difficult for our military commanders to sometimes work with them because, again, a mother will do anything to protect her children. She's, at first and foremost, she's nurturing and a protector of her family. So how do we then counter that with a different message? Do we say that mothers should not nurture their families, should not nurture their insurgent sons? No, we take the same principle of nurturing and we use these messages, if you can read it very quickly, that a mother will still nurture her family, but she'll do it by using these, seeing Islam as a religion of peace, using the same verses in the Quran, the same hadith literature, so that she remains a protectorate by denouncing violence, and she will use hadith literature, for example. The very famous one you've probably heard, Paradise Lies at the Feet of Mothers. And so what does that mean? That means that then children should have great respect for their mothers. Children should listen to their mothers and not be swayed or misguided. And this one is probably one of my favorites, which is from Surah Al-Ma'idah, a very, a verse that's often quoted, that if you kill one person, you kill all of humanity. You save one person, you save all of humanity. And verses like that can be used to positively reflect a strong and resilient Muslim family. Now, I cannot show you the video, but I'm going to walk you through the video. So this was used in the Speak Up campaign. It was called Speak Up, which I'm translating for you from Arabic. And so here's a woman, and she walks into a room, and there's a coffin, all right? And it's clear that her husband is dead. So, right, she's saying, my husband was such a good man. I mean, she's bereaved. She doesn't understand how her husband could have been a suicide bomber, and that he, look at the words. He was devout. By the way, this was a national ad campaign, so it was aired on, television. And then you see a little girl here. And so what you're trying to see is what the Mothers of Iraq campaign is, again, that this violence kind of tears apart families. And this is what Al-Qaeda does, that, as we all know, it's a destructive force. So and then this is the most powerful one, that it's you. I liked what Scott Mann said, that we are all the protagonists. Well, Muslim communities and families are also, if the community and families are torn apart, they're the ultimate victims. So speak up, because the true voice of Islam is you. And so now these very overarching kind of 3 things I want to say, and then I promise I will either entertain questions or pass the mic, is change. Change comes from within. I don't want to call this an Islamic revolution, an Islamic reformation. In fact, some Muslims actually detest those terms. They're not really, but there is a need for an Islamic, there's a debate and discussion and a vibrant discourse. And I'll tell you, it's happening already. It's happening particularly in America, the communities that I'm involved with, and the masajids or the masjids, the mosques that I'm involved with, it's already happening. But they won't talk about it openly within the CVE-CT platform. That's not the language, it's not the vernacular that's being used, but what they're talking about is, for example, I'm part of a workshop and it's ending, but it's a course that's being done for the very first time in America, and then they're going to take it to 20 different cities in America in the Muslim community. It's the Family Life Workshop. So recognizing the importance of family, and they're doing this using a business model because it's taught by a businessman. And that, I think, is very powerful, because you're actually you're talking about issues more openly and how to strengthen families by being integrative and understanding how to live and prosper and thrive within an American society. I find that, again, these voice of moderation, as we call it. In fact, the US government likes to use the term credible voices. Well, here's a credible voice. In fact, Amr Khalid was here. He's Egyptian. He's a very powerful speaker. He reminds me of Joel Osteen. And this man can really, with emotional appeal, with reason and logic, denounce violence and talk about some even very, political issues. By the way, there are also Muslim comedians who are doing the same thing. But I'm just wanted to give you the example of Amr Khalid. And he's focusing on the shabab, the youth, because this is where, if we're going to have an impact, it would be the youth. Mobeen, Suleiman Baqi, if you know, he's Jordanian, and he's done some fabulous cartoons and comics, and he's highlighting the same way that the Kuwaiti, who's the founder of the 99 cartoons, it's the same idea of promoting superheroes for the Arab youth, so that they don't look to the likes of al-Baghdadi and formerly bin Laden, but they have their own heroes within their, again, coming back to what I said earlier, your Islamic history, knowing your Islamic theology, and the people. And once you can focus on the people, you can also see within the Islamic civilization, there were great people and great leaders, rather than looking on, to those who espouse violence. Now, I put this in here because I do think that the clerics play a role. There are, as we know, religious enablers of jihad who, are professed clerics. The one-eyed Taliban commander, who I'm thinking of, Mullah Omar, that's right. So how can I forget him? Yeah, Mullah Omar, is a professed cleric. And I find in certain countries, these clerics actually, unless you have a degree in Islamic jurisprudence and Islamic law, you cannot even claim to be a cleric. But there are these messages. What is really important within the Muslim world is to dissipate sectarianism. Sectarian violence, I would argue, in the last few years is on the rise among Muslim communities. I see this in my own birth country. In fact, we just saw this a few weeks ago on Easter Sunday, and I spoke about it publicly, the attack on Christians, but also the attacks that continue to this day against Sunnis and Shias and so forth, and we all know. And so I think that's very important when the Jordanian king brought together over 200 plus clerics in a single platform to have them sign this, like a United Nations resolution to say we disagree with sectarianism. It's the same what's happening. Many people refer to the Moroccan model, the Marrakesh model. Morocco is an example of moderation, because in Morocco, the only Muslim country today where women can actually they can train to be an imam. And so you have these initiatives that are important. And then this is my last slide, which is what's happening now. I truly, I'm wedded to that hadith about paradise lies at the feet of mothers. And so many mothers today, particularly in Europe, who have lost their children to ISIS are speaking out. And the woman who's featured here, her son Damien, I think the way to understand this rather than me telling you the long story, is that when I meet, I remember many years ago I met, he used to call himself Abu Jihad. And he was a Chechen. And many years ago, I remember listening to his story and so many other stories and interviews I've conducted with people. I don't want to make a blanket statement to say they were disturbed, but certainly they lacked two things. They didn't have a strong sense of self and identity, and they needed a place to belong. And these are two very critical factors. And the same with this woman who lost her son, Damien, who at the age of 17 tried to commit suicide. And then suddenly in the hospital discovered the Quran, and then joins Islam, and then says, and lies to his mother and says he's going to Egypt. Instead of going to Egypt, he ends up in Syria. And he says he's joining Jabhat al-Nusra. And then later, his mother is online searching for her son, and she finds out now he's joined ISIS. And then the messages drop off, and suddenly she loses her son. And my question, I'm a mother of two teenagers as well, and my question is, what happened not when he joined ISIS or when he decided to leave Egypt, but what happened when he was 17 trying to commit suicide? Like, what happened in that stage of that child's life? And so as a parent, I truly believe that those are some warning signs that we need to pay attention to. Anyhow, I've given you, I think, hopefully enough to think about. And since, because of lack of limited time, I won't have an opportunity to listen to your comments or answer your questions, but I'll be here and look forward to engaging you. Thank you for your attention.